Good morning. On this Monday, we look at Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 25, and we find Jesus on trial. He's been on trial before the religious leaders all night long, and as they ask, "Are you the Son of God?" and he says, "You say that I am." And chapter 25 after that begins with, "They rose as a multitude," or the assembly rose as a body. All of the people, they just were, boom, they were upset, and they get up and they take Jesus to Pilate. And they bring accusations against him. They're trying to show Pilate that Jesus is against the government. And he tells us to refuse to pay taxes. He says, they're just telling a bunch of lies to Pilate about Jesus. And Pilate sees through this, and he isn't going to let their religious ideals, get into the political realm of things. And Pilate's, he asks Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And Jesus' answer, according to Luke, is, "You say so." And Pilate then says, "I find no basis for the accusations you bring against him." What you're accusing him of isn't against the Roman government. It isn't against anything that I can find that is worthy of sentencing him to death or to any punishment. I want to let him go. But then, he stirs up people by teaching throughout all Judea and Galilee. It's just, so when they mention Galilee, Pilate, okay, well, he's one of Herod's responsibilities. I'll send him to Herod. And Luke tells us that Herod was excited to see Jesus because he would like to see a miracle. He would like to hear Jesus preach and teach. Herod, had heard about this Jesus. And, he questioned him, but, Jesus didn't even speak back to Herod. He didn't answer him. And Herod then got upset because of that, but also because the chief priests continued to accuse Jesus of all of these things, and, when you're accused of things that you haven't done, it was all this slander is what it really was. They were mocking him, they were slandering him, and they were saying things, against Jesus that weren't true. Jesus wasn't an insurrectionist. When they asked him, "Well, what do you say about paying taxes? Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's." But they were turning the tables because these religious leaders just had to get rid of Jesus because he was just causing too much heartache for them. He was beginning to get too many people to believe that he's the Messiah. And that just didn't fly with the majority of the religious leaders. And so Herod, not really finding anything against Jesus either, but he treats him with contempt, mocks him, puts an elegant robe on him, and sends him back to Pilate. And then, as a kind of almost an afterthought, Luke writes and tells us that day Pilate and Herod became friends. And before that, they hadn't been friendly with each other. And, it's just kind of makes me wonder, well, what's going on here, But that, Pilate and Herod, both tried to release Jesus, didn't find any guilt in him, but yet succumbed to the pressure of the people. Verse 13 says, Pilate called them together, the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said, "You bring me this man as one who is perverting the people, and I've examined him, and I have not found him guilty of any of your charges. Neither has Herod." So here's Pilate telling them, we can't find him guilty. What are we supposed to charge him with? We want to let him go because he's not guilty of any crimes against the state, especially that has done nothing to deserve death. but I'll have him flogged and released. Will that make you happy? Try to appease them with a little bit of punishment. But a little bit of punishment wasn't nearly enough. So they all started shouting. I mean, this is a little bit different telling than we've read other gospels, but the crowds begin cheering for the release of Barabbas. I mean, they know that at this festival of the unleavened bread, the Passover that they're gathered for, they know that it's the custom for one prisoner to be released. So they begin calling for him to release Barabbas and punish Jesus. Give Jesus Barabbas's punishment, basically. Make Jesus the scapegoat and release this despicable person. Really, is what Barabbas was. And Pilate, still, he says, verse 20, wanting to release Jesus, addressed him again, but they kept shouting, crucify him, crucify him. So Pilate, 3 times, the third time he says, well, why? What evil has he done? So Pilate tries 3 times to release Jesus into these people. He tries to get them to understand reason and logic. I mean, he's not guilty. Why should he deserve punishment? And it's the reality hits us too. I mean, Jesus wasn't guilty of anything deserving death, and especially as the Son of God, the Messiah. Although Jesus knew what had to happen, he had told his disciples clearly what was going to happen. And so Jesus didn't argue. He didn't try to talk his way out of what was going on, even though we know that he could have very easily. But he as well gave in. He followed the will of God. And so after the third time, Pilate says, I will have him flogged and release him, but they kept urgently demanding with shouts that he should be crucified. And Luke writes, their voices prevailed. I have those words underlined in my Bible. Their voices prevailed. And it's a reminder a little bit of, we read in our history about the Salem witch trials and people, so wrongly convicted so often, and we get an idea in our heads or a thought in our heads as well, a prejudice, and it's really hard to overcome that prejudice, that thought we have, and that's what it was for these people. The religious leaders had turned them against Jesus. I mean, how they did that is just beyond me, because just a few days earlier, all of the shouting and the cheering as Jesus came in on that Palm Sunday that we call it, and the procession, but yet they had turned the people against Jesus, and their shouting prevails. So Pilate gave his verdict that the people's demand would be released, would be approved, or carried out, and he released Barabbas, turned Jesus over to have done as they wished. And that's where we end today. And it just doesn't ever get any easier to read this part of the Gospels, to see how the people just like you and me, turn against Jesus. And I see it. I mean, I made a comment on Facebook not so awfully long ago about I'm tired. I'm tired of the hatred. I'm tired of the anger. I'm tired of, but it's still there. I mean, it doesn't matter which party you support or whatever it is. There's anger and hatred on both sides, and so seeing how that is in our world today, I can understand how this all came about against Jesus, and there's all of this. There's stuff that's just not true. But what's true is that God loves each and every one of us. and enough so that Jesus submitted to all of this stuff going on.